My name is Pat Tully of the Ketchikan Public Library, and this is Reading Aloud. This evening I'm reading from Washington Irving's A History of New York, from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty, by Dietrich Knickerbocker, which is a satirical history of New Amsterdam, which, as you know, later became New York. Before its publication, Irving placed a series of missing persons advertisements in New York newspapers, seeking information on Dietrich Knickerbocker, a Dutch historian who had allegedly gone missing from his hotel in New York City. He then, Irving did, placed a notice from the hotel's proprietor informing readers that, if Knickerbocker failed to return to the hotel to pay his bill, he'd publish the manuscript of Knickerbocker's that he had left behind. So then, Irving published his work, and its popularity made him famous. So let's get started. Walter Van Twiller. It was in the year of our Lord, 1629, that Mynheer Walter Van Twiller was appointed governor of the province of New Netherlands, under the commission and control of their high mightinesses, the Lord States General of the United Netherlands and the privileged West India Company. This renowned old gentleman arrived at New Amsterdam in the merry month of June, the sweetest month in all the year, when the Apollo seems to dance up the transparent firmament, when the robin, the thrush, and 1,000 other wanton songsters make the woods to resound with their amorous ditties, and the luxurious little bodkins revels among the clover blossoms of the meadows. All which happy coincidences persuaded the old dames of New Amsterdam, who were skilled in the art of foretelling events, that this would be a happy and prosperous administration. The renowned Walter Van Twiller was descended from a long line of Dutch burgomasters, who had successively dozed away their lives and grown fat upon the bench of magistracy in Rotterdam, and who had comported themselves with such singular wisdom and propriety that they were never either heard of or talked of, which, next to being universally applauded, should be the object of ambition of all magistrates and rulers. There are two opposite ways by which some men make a figure of the world, one by talking faster than they think, and the other by holding their tongues and not thinking at all. By the first, many a smatterer acquires the reputation of a man of quick parts. By the other, many a dunderpate, like the owl, the stupidest of birds, comes to be considered the very type of wisdom. This, by the way, is a casual remark, which I would not for the universe have it thought I apply to Governor Van Twiller. It is true he was a man shut up within himself like an oyster, and rarely spoke except in monosyllables. But then it was allowed he seldom said a foolish thing. So invincible was his gravity that he was never known to laugh or even to smile through the whole course of a long and prosperous life. Nay, if a joke were uttered in his presence that set light-minded hearers in a roar, it was observed to throw him into a state of perplexity. Sometimes he would deign to inquire into the matter, and when, after much explanation, the joke was made plain as a pikestaff, he would continue to smoke his pipe in silence, and at length, knocking out the ashes, would exclaim, "Well, I see nothing in all that to laugh about." With all his reflective habits, he never made up his mind on a subject. His adherents accounted for this by the astonishing magnitude of his ideas. He conceived every subject on so grand a scale that he had not room in his head to turn it over and examine both sides of it. Certain it is that, if any matter were propounded to him on which ordinary mortals would rashly determine at first glance, he would put on a vague, mysterious look, shake his capacious head, smoke some time in profound silence, and at length observe that he had his doubts about the matter, which gained him the reputation of a man slow of belief and not easily imposed upon. What is more, it gained him a lasting name, for to this habit of the mind has been attributed his surname of Twiller, which is said to be a corruption of the original Twilfer, or, in plain English, doubter. The person of this illustrious old gentleman was formed and proportioned as though it had been molded by the hands of some cunning Dutch statuary, as a model of majesty and lordly grandeur. He was exactly 5 feet 6 inches in height, and 6 feet 5 inches in circumference. His head was a perfect sphere, and of such stupendous dimensions that Dame Nature, with all her sex's ingenuity, would have been puzzled to construct a neck capable of supporting it. Wherefore she wisely declined the attempt, and settled it firmly on the top of his backbone, just between the shoulders. His body was oblong, and particularly capacious at bottom, which was wisely ordered by Providence, seeing that he was a man of sedentary habits, and very averse to the idle labor of walking. His legs were short, but sturdy in proportion to the weight they had to sustain, so that when erect he had not a little the appearance of a beer barrel on skids. His face, that infallible index of the mind, presented a vast expanse, unfurrowed by those lines and angles which disfigure the human countenance with what is termed expression. 2 small gray eyes twinkled feebly in the midst, like 2 stars of lesser magnitude in a hazy firmament, and his full-fed cheeks, which seemed to have taken toll of everything that went into his mouth, were curiously mottled and streaked with the dusky red, like a Spitzenberg apple. His habits were as regular as his person. He daily took his 4 stated meals, appropriating exactly an hour to each. He smoked and doubted 8 hours, and he slept the remaining 12 of the 24. Such was the renowned Walter von Twiller, a true philosopher, for his mind was either elevated above or tranquilly settled below the cares and perplexities of this world. He had lived in it for years without feeling the least curiosity to know whether the sun revolved around it or it around the sun, and he had watched for at least half a century the smoke curling from his pipe to the ceiling, without once troubling his head with any of those numerous theories by which a philosopher would have perplexed his brain, in accounting for its rising above the surrounding atmosphere. In his council he presided with great state and solemnity. He sat in a huge chair of solid oak, hewn in the celebrated forest of the Hague, fabricated by an experienced timmerman of Amsterdam, and curiously carved about the arms and feet into exact imitation of the gigantic eagle's claws. Instead of a scepter, he swayed a long Turkish pipe, wrought with jasmine and amber, which had been presented to a stadtholder of Holland at the conclusion of a treaty with one of the petty Barbary powers. In this stately chair he would sit, and this magnificent pipe would he smoke, shaking his right knee with a constant motion, and fixing his eye for hours altogether on a little print of Amsterdam, which hung in a black frame against the opposite wall of the council chamber. Nay, it has even been said that when any deliberation of extraordinary length and intricacy was on the carpet, the renowned voter would shut his eyes for 2 full hours at a time, that he might not be disturbed by external objects. And at such times the internal commotion of his mind was evinced by certain regular guttural sounds, which his admirers declared were merely the noise of conflict made by his contending doubts and opinions. It is with infinite difficulty I have been enabled to collect these biographical anecdotes of the great man under consideration. The facts respecting him were so scattered and vague, and diverse of them so questionable in point of authenticity, that I have had to give up the search after many, and decline the admission of still more, which would have tended to heighten the coloring of his portrait. I have been the more anxious to delineate fully the person and habits of Walter van Twiller, from the consideration that he was not only the first, but also the best governor that ever presided over this ancient and respectable province. And so tranquil and benevolent was his reign, that I do not find throughout the whole of it a single instance of any offender being brought to punishment, a most indubitable sign of a merciful governor, and a case unparalleled, except in the reign of the illustrious King Log, from whom, it is hinted, the renowned Van Twiller was a lineal descendant. The very outset of the career of this excellent magistrate was distinguished by an example of legal acumen that gave flattering presage of a wise and equitable administration. The morning after he had been installed in office, and at the moment he was making his breakfast from a prodigious earthen dish, filled with milk and pudding, he was interrupted by the appearance of Wandel Schoonhoven, a very important old burgher of New Amsterdam, who complained bitterly about one Barent Bleecker, inasmuch as he refused to come to a settlement of accounts, seeing that there was a heavy balance in favor of said Wandel. Governor Van Twiller, as I have already observed, was a man of few words. He was likewise a mortal enemy to multiplying writings, or being disturbed at his breakfast. Having listened attentively to the statement of Wandel Schoonhoven, giving an occasional grunt as he shoveled a spoonful of pudding into his mouth, either as a sign that he relished the dish or comprehended the story, he called unto him his constable, and pulling out of his breeches pocket a huge jackknife, dispatched it after the defendant as a summons, accompanied by his tobacco box as a warrant. This summary process was as effectual in those simple days as was the seal ring of the great Harun al-Rashid among his true believers. The two parties being confronted before him, each produced a book of accounts, written in a language and character that would have puzzled any but a high Dutch commentator or a learned decipherer of Egyptian obelisks. The sage Wiltshire took them one after the other, and having poised them in his hands and attentively counted over the number of leaves, fell straightway into a very great doubt, and smoked for half an hour without saying a word. At length, laying his finger beside his nose and shutting his eyes for a moment, with the air of a man who has just caught a subtle idea by the tail, he slowly took his pipe from his mouth, puffed forth a column of tobacco smoke, and with marvelous gravity and solemnity pronounced, that, having carefully counted over the leaves and weighed the books, it was found that the one was just as thick and heavy as the other. Therefore, it was the final opinion of the court that the accounts were equally balanced. Therefore, Wandel should give Barent a receipt, and Barent should give Wandel a receipt, and the constable should pay the costs. This decision, being straightway made known, diffused general joy throughout New Amsterdam, for the people immediately perceived that they had a wise and equitable magistrate to rule over them. But its happiest effect was that not another lawsuit took place throughout the whole of his administration, and the office of constable fell into such decay that there was not one of those lousel scouts known in the province for many years. I am the more particular in dwelling on this transaction, not only because I deem it one of the most sage and righteous judgments on record, and well worthy of the attention of modern magistrates, but because it was a miraculous event in the history of the renowned Walter, being the only time he was ever known to come to a decision in the whole course of his life. Wilhelmus Klieft. As some sleek ox, sunk in the rich repose of a clover field, dozing and chewing the cud, will bear repeated blows before it raises itself, so the province of New Netherlands, having waxed fat under the drowsy reign of the doubter, needed cuffs and kicks to rouse it into action. The reader will now witness the manner in which a peaceful community advances toward a state of war, which is apt to be like the approach of a horse to a drum, with much prancing and little progress, and too often with the wrong end foremost. Wilhelmus Kieft, who in 1634 ascended the gubernatorial chair, to borrow a favorite though clumsy appellation of modern phraseologists, was of lofty descent, his father being inspector of windmills in the ancient town of Saardam, and our hero, we are told, when a boy, made very curious investigations into the nature and operations of these machines, which was one reason why he afterward came to be so ingenious a governor. His name, according to the most authentic entomologist, was a corruption of Kiver, that is to say, a wrangler or scolder, and expressed the characteristic of his family, which for nearly 2 centuries have kept the windy town of Saardam in hot water and produced more Tartars and brimstones than any 10 families in the place. And so truly did he inherit this family peculiarity, that he had not been a year in the government of the province before he was universally denominated as William the Testy. His appearance answered to his name. He was a brisk, wiry, waspish old gentleman, such a one as may now and then be seen stumping about our city in a broad-skirted coat with huge buttons, a cocked hat stuck on the back of his head, and a cane as high as his chin. His face was broad, but his features were sharp. His cheeks were scorched into a dusky red by two fiery little gray eyes. His nose turned up, and the corners of his mouth turned down, pretty much like the muzzle of an irritable pug dog. I have heard it observed by a profound adept in human physiology that if a woman waxes fat with the progress of years, her tenure of life is somewhat precarious. But if happily she withers as she grows old, she lives forever. Such promised to be the case with William the Testy, who grew tough in proportion as he dried. He had withered, in fact, not through the process of years, but through the tropical fervor of his soul, which burnt like a vehement rushlight in his bosom, inciting him to incessant broils and bickerings. Ancient tradition speaks much of his learning, and of the gallant inroads he has made into the dead languages, in which he had made captive a host of Greek nouns and Latin verbs, and brought off rich booty in ancient saws and apothegms, which he was wont to parade in his public harangues as a triumph general of yore, his spolia optima. Of metaphysics he knew enough to confound all hearers and himself into the bargain. In logic he knew the whole family of syllogisms and dilemmas, and was so proud of his skill that he never suffered even a self-evident fact to pass unargued. It was observed, however, that he seldom got into an argument without getting into a perplexity, and then into a passion with his adversary, for not being convinced gratis. He had, moreover, skirmished smartly on the frontiers of several of the sciences, was fond of experimental philosophy, and prided himself upon inventions of all kinds. His abode, which he had fixed at a bowery or country seat a short distance from the city, just at what is now called Dutch Street, soon abounded with proofs of his ingenuity. Patent smoke-jacks that required a horse to work them, Dutch ovens that roasted meat without fire, carts that went before the horses, weathercocks that turned against the wind, and other wrong-headed contrivances that astonished and confounded all beholders. The house, too, was beset by paralytic cats and dogs, the subject of his experimental philosophy, and the yelling and yelping of the latter unhappy victims of science, while aiding in the pursuit of knowledge, soon gained for the place the name of Dog's Misery, by which it continues to be known even at the present day. It is in knowledge as in swimming. He who flounders and splashes on the surface makes more noise and attracts more attention than the pearl diver who quietly dives in quest of treasures to the bottom. The vast acquirements of the new governor were the theme of marvel among the simple burghers of New Amsterdam. He figured about the place as learned a man as Bonze at Peking, who had mastered one half of the Chinese alphabet and was universally pronounced a universal genius. Thus end the authenticated chronicles of the reign of William the Testy, for henceforth, in the troubles, perplexities, and confusion of the times, he seems to have been totally overlooked, and to have slipped forever through the fingers of scrupulous history. It is true that certain of the early provincial poets, of whom there were great numbers in New Netherland, taking advantage of his mysterious exit, have fabled that, like Romulus, he was translated to the skies, and forms a very fiery little star somewhere on the left claw of the crab, while others, equally fanciful, declare that he had experienced a fate similar to that of the good King Arthur, who, we are assured by the ancient bards, was carried away to the delicious abodes of fairyland, where he still exists in pristine worth and vigor, and will one day or another return to restore the gallantry, the honor, and the immaculate probity which prevailed in the glorious days of the Round Table. All these, however, are but pleasing fantasies, the cobweb visions of those dreaming varlets, the poets, to which I would not have my judicious readers attach any credibility. Neither am I disposed to credit an ancient and rather apocryphal historian who asserts that the ingenious Wilhelmus was annihilated by the blowing down of one of his windmills. nor a writer of latter times who affirms that he fell victim to an experiment in natural history, having the misfortune to break his neck from a garret window of the Stadthouse in attempting to catch swallows by sprinkling salt upon their tails. Still less do I put my faith in the tradition that he perished at sea in conveying home to Holland a treasure of golden ore, discovered somewhere among the haunted regions of the Catskill Mountains. The most probable account declares that, what with the constant troubles on his frontiers, the incessant schemings and projects going on in his own pericranium, the memorials, petitions, remonstrances, and sage pieces of advice of respectable meetings of the sovereign people, and the refractory disposition of his counselors, who were sure to differ from him on every point, and uniformly to be in the wrong, his mind was kept in a furnace heat until he became as completely burnt out as a Dutch family pipe which has passed through 3 generations of hard smokers. In this manner did he undergo a kind of animal combustion, consuming away like a farthing rushlight, so that when grim death finally snuffed him out, there was scarce enough left of him to bury. PeterStuyvesant. PeterStuyvesant was the last and, like the renowned Walter van Twiller, the best of our ancient Dutch governors, Walter having surpassed all who preceded him, and Peter, or Piet, as he was socially called by the old Dutch burghers, who were ever prone to familiarize names, having never been equaled by any successor. He was, in fact, the very man fitted by nature to retrieve the desperate fortunes of her beloved province, had not the fates, those most potent and unrelenting of all ancient spinsters, destined them to inextricable confusion. To say merely that he was a hero would be doing him a great injustice. He was, in truth, a combination of heroes, for he was of a sturdy, raw-boned make, like Ajax Telamon, with a pair of round shoulders that Hercules would have given his hide for, meaning his lion's hide, when he undertook the ease-old Atlas of his load. He was, moreover, as Plutarch describes Coriolanus, not only terrible for the force of his arm, but likewise of his voice, which sounded as though it came out of a barrel, and, like the self-same warrior, he possessed a sovereign contempt for the sovereign people, and an iron aspect which was enough of itself to make the very bowels of his adversaries quake with terror and dismay. All this martial excellency of appearance was inexpressibly heightened by an accidental advantage, with which I am surprised that neither Homer nor Virgil have graced any of their heroes. This was nothing less than a wooden leg, which was the only prize he had gained in bravely fighting the battles of his country, but of which he was so proud that he was often heard to declare that he valued it more than all his other limbs put together. Indeed, so highly did he esteem it, that he had it gallantly enchased and relieved with silver devices, which caused it to be related in diverse history and legends that he wore a silver leg. The very first movements of the great Peter, on taking the reins of government, displayed his magnanimity, though they occasioned not a little marvel and uneasiness among the people of the Manhattoes. Finding himself constantly interrupted by the opposition, and annoyed by the advice of his privy council, the members of which had acquired the unreasonable habit of thinking and speaking for themselves during the preceding reign, he determined at once to put a stop to all such grievous abominations. Scarcely, therefore, had he entered upon his authority, than he turned out of office all the meddlesome spirits of the factious cabinet of William the Testy, in place of whom he chose unto himself counsellors from those fat, somniferous, respectable burghers who had flourished and slumbered under the easy reign of Walter the Doubter. All these he caused to be furnished with abundance of fair long pipes, and to be regaled with frequent corporation dinners, admonishing them to smoke, to eat, and sleep for the good of the nation, while he took the burden of government onto his own shoulders, an arrangement to which they all gave hearty acquiescence. Nor did he stop here, but made a hideous rout among the inventions and expedients of his learned predecessor, rooting up his patent gallows, where the caitiff vagabonds were suspended by the waistband, demolishing his flagstaffs and windmills, which, like mighty giants, guarded the ramparts of New Amsterdam, pitching to the Duvel whole batteries of Quaker guns, and, in a word, turning topsy-turvy the whole philosophic, economic, and windmill system of the immortal sage of Saardam. The honest folks of New Amsterdam began to quake now for the fate of their matchless champion, Anthony the Trumpeter, who had acquired prodigious favor in the eyes of the women by means of his whiskers and his trumpet. Him did Peter the Headstrong cause to be brought into his presence, and eyeing him for a moment from head to foot, with a countenance that would have appalled anything else than a sounder of brass. "Prithee, who and what art thou?" said he. "Sire," replied the other, in no wise dismayed, "for my name it is Anthony von Korlier. For my parentage I am the son of my mother. For my profession I am champion and garrison of this great city of New Amsterdam." "I doubt me much," said PeterStuyvesant, "that thou art some scurvy costermonger knave. How didst thou acquire this paramount honor and dignity?" "Marry, sir," replied the other, "like many a great man before me, by simply sounding my own trumpet." "Aye, is it so?" quoth the governor. "Why then let us have a relish of thy art." Whereupon the good Anthony put his instrument to his lips, and sounded a charge with such a tremendous outset, such a delectable quaver, and such a triumphant cadence, that it was enough to make one's heart leap out of one's mouth, only to be within a mile of it. Like as a war-worn charger, grazing in peaceful plains, starts at the strain of martial music, pricks up his ears, and snorts and paws and kindles at the noise, so did the heroic Peter joy to hear the clangor of the trumpet. For of him might truly be said, what was recorded of the renowned St. George of England, that there was nothing in all the world that more rejoiced his heart than to hear the pleasant sound of war, and to see the soldiers brandish forth their steeled weapons. Casting his eye more kindly, therefore, upon the sturdy Van Korlier, and finding him to be a jovial varlet, shrewd in his discourse, yet of great discretion and immeasurable wind, he straightway conceived a vast kindness for him, and discharging him from the troublesome duty of garrisoning, defending and alarming the city, ever after retained him about his person as his chief favorite, confidential envoy, and trusty squire. Instead of disturbing the city with disastrous notes, he was instructed to play so as to delight the governor while at his repasts, as did the minstrels of yore in the days of glorious chivalry, and on all public occasions to rejoice the ears of the people with warlike melodies, thereby keeping alive a noble and martial spirit. General van Pothenberg. It is tropically observed by the honest old Socrates that heaven infuses into some men at their birth a portion of intellectual gold, into others an intellectual silver, while others are intellectually furnished with iron and brass. Of the last class was General von Pothenberg, and it would seem as if Dame Nature, who will sometimes be partial, had given him brass enough for a dozen ordinary braziers. All this he had contrived to pass off upon William the Testy for genuine gold, and the little governor would sit for hours and listen to his gunpowder stories of exploits, which left those of Tirante the White, Don Bellianus of Greece, or St. George and the Dragon quite in the background. Having been promoted by William Kieft to the position of his whole disposable forces, he gave importance to his station by the grand eloquence of his bulletins, always styling himself Commander-in-Chief of the armies of the New Netherlands, though in sober truth these armies were nothing more than a handful of hen-stealing, bottle-bruising ragamuffins. In person he was not very tall, but exceedingly round. Neither did his bulk proceed from his being fat, but windy, being blown up by a prodigious conviction of his own importance, until he resembled one of those bags of winds given by Aeolus in an incredible fit of generosity to that vagabond warrior Ulysses. His windy endowments had long excited the admiration of Anthony van Korlier, who is said to have hinted more than once to William the Testy that in making Van Pothenberg a general he had spoiled an admirable trumpeter. As is the practice in ancient story to give the reader a description of the arms and equipments of every noted warrior, I will bestow a word upon the dress of this redoubtable commander. It comported with his character, being so crossed and slashed and embroidered with lace and tinsel that he seemed to have had as much brass without as nature had stored away within. He was swathed, too, in a crimson sash, of the side and texture of a fishing net, doubtless to keep his swelling heart from bursting through his ribs. His face glowed with furnace heat from between a huge pair of well-endowed whiskers, and his valorous soul seemed ready to bounce out of a pair of large, glassy, blinking eyes, projecting like those of a lobster. I swear to thee, worthy reader, if history and tradition belie not this warrior, I would give all the money in my pocket to have seen him accoutred. Booted to the middle, sashed to the chin, collared to the ears, whiskered to the teeth, crowned with an overshadowing cocked hat, and girded with a leathern belt 10 inches broad, from which trailed a fascion of a length that I dare not mention. Thus equipped, he strutted about, as bitter-looking a man of war as the far-famed Moor of Moor Hall when he sallied forth to slay the dragon of Wantley. For what says the ballad? Had you but seen him in this dress, how fierce he looked and how big, you would have thought him for to be some Egyptian corcupig. He frighted all, cats, dogs, and all, each cow, each horse, and each hog. For fear they did flee, for they took him to be some strange outlandish hedgehog. The end. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have a very good week.